Alrighty, so today we're going to be teaching the addendum for backup contract. Before we go into this, I'm going to go over to paragraph 5 of the 1 to 4 family contract. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different things here so you guys reiterate where we're really going to be focused at. And some of the intricate parts of this contract is going to be dictated on paragraph 5. So let's go over here to our 1 to 4 family contract. The reason I want to bring up paragraph 5, because paragraph 5 outlines how the delivery of earnest money and option money is going to be handled. And the reason this is so significant is because in the backup addendum for backup contract, the first thing we got to do is, if you read paragraph A in this contract, it says the contract to which this addendum is attached, the backup contract, is binding upon execution by parties, and the earnest money and option fee must be paid as follows. Now, they give you the option of the first option being number 1. It says buyer shall deliver earnest money and option fee as provided in paragraph 5 of the backup contract. This becomes, the 1 to 4 family becomes a backup contract with this addendum. The combination of both of them being used together, and actually going a little bit further down, if I may, so if you was doing this, and to make it legally, the way it's supposed to be legally binding, in paragraph 22 of the 1 to 4 family contract, you would have to check off the addendum for backup contract here, right? You would check that off. And the combination of having this addendum now makes that 1 to 4 family a backup contract. I hope everybody understands that, because I think that's the first thing you got to understand is how to form the addendum for backup contract. How do you form it? You form it with the combination of using paragraph 22, checking off addendum for backup contract, and also adding the addendum for backup contract. And now we have just formed a backup contract. Why would you want to use a backup contract? Let's go with the scenarios based on this. You have a buyer who loves this property, who wants it, and they find out it's under contract, and the buyer is willing to go in a backup position, sometimes called second position, while they wait on the sidelines to see what's going to happen with the original contract or first position. This was happening a lot in COVID because people were just going rampant and buying homes, and buyers was willing to wait on the sideline just to see if this home was going to actually close with the first contract. And they were going in second position or backup position. And this is how it was being formed for them to wait to see if they were going to be able to get this home. Now, according to TREC and according to Texas Realtors, we as agents, we can only take one backup offer per house. It's not to say that you can have more people in the backup position, but to form that, you got to have that with a lawyer through an attorney to go in where you have first position, second position, third position, fourth position, things of that nature. You cannot do more than one backup contract. All right. So those are the scenarios I can really think of as it does happen, that people are willing to sit there and say, okay, hey, look, I want to see what's happening with this first contract, and I'm willing to go under contract in the backup position in order to see if I can get this house. And this is where this form is used for. All right. Now, it's not uncommon in hot markets. This form is probably hugely used in hot markets. We're probably not seeing it as much today as we saw it in 2020, 2021, and half of 2022. It was used very often. So that's what this is for. Now let's keep on going on because I want you to understand that there's portions of this we really need to understand. So as you go into this, part two, right here in part two, the second option, let's go back to one. If you read one, it says buyer shall deliver earnest money and option money as provided in paragraph 5 of the backup contract. Let's say your buyer, let's say we had a house that the buyer wants to go in the contract in a backup position right now today. And they're like, okay, hey, we don't want to give up earnest money immediately right now. However, you could fill this out and say, okay, earnest money of $2,000 and option money of $100 within 5 days of the amended effective date of the backup contract. Now that word amended effective date means that when the buyer is notified that was in second position or in backup position, and they're notified that they now became in first position, that becomes the amended effective date. So let's go back to this original buyer that we were just talking about. They don't want to put the earnest money down until they find out that they're in first position. That's where you would fill this out, where they would sit there and say, okay, once they've been notified that they're in first position, now they got to give earnest money. Now they got to get option money based on the amended effective date in terms of what this looks like. So they could put something like this, $2,000, not 20 grand, could be 20 grand. Option fee of $250. And then within 7 days, if they wanted to, of the amended effective date, once they were notified, that's the amended effective date, within 7 days of that date, now they have to come to the title company with a $2,000 or $250. This is how that is acted. So if they don't have this filled out and we go back up here and it's filled out here, they have to do it within that timeline. All right. So the effective date is the effective date. So if we went on the contract and you had put $2,000 for earnest money, if you had put $2,000 here for earnest money and then the $250 here, essentially what you're saying is that on the effective date, which is the date of execution, today, they would have to put $2,000 and they would have to put the $250 within the required 3 days here. Based on that, they would have to do it now. Opposed to doing it like this, they wouldn't have to do that until they was notified that they are in first position. So those are the two ways that this form is used. And this is one of those conversations that you have with your buyer. Hey, do you really want to put the money up now, or do you want to put the money up when you find out that you're in first position? So obviously the best way, if you're in the earnest of your buyer, is probably to sit there and do it this way so they don't have to put money up at the effective date. The amended date is the date once they're notified that they're in first position, versus the effective date is the date of execution of this contract. This contract has to be negotiated back and forth the same as any other contract. However, the only difference when you add the backup addendum is going to be the difference of how the earnest money is delivered and when the earnest money is delivered. All right. Any questions about that before I go on?
I do have a question, Ben. Thank you for the training today. For the 124, do we still fill that section as well, or just leave it blank if we're gonna fill up the backup contract for the section 5?
Yep, you will leave this all blank. I don't like leaving stuff blank. If you can put an A, something like that, so we have something in there, it'd be great. But you're right, you should put something in there or leave it blank.
Okay.
And I say
Sounds
something in terms of NA, so everybody knows it's not applicable, but you're using this over here as the backup addendum. Anybody else? Okay, so let's keep on going. I'm not going to go back to the 1 to 4 family anymore. We're going to pretty teach off this right here. So this right here, where it has the next part here in part B, it says if the last day to deliver the option money, earnest money and option money falls on a Saturday or Sunday or holiday, it's just like the contract. It says, okay, hey, look, this is extended to the next day that's not a Saturday, not a Sunday, or not a holiday. So that's the same as in the contract, same verbiage there is in the contract. So if your earnest money day, an option money day falls upon these days, then you are extended to the next day that's not a Sunday, Saturday, or legal holiday. Part C, it says the amounts and escrow agents receive in paragraph A2 of this addendum shall be applied first to the option fee and then to the earnest money. This is again like the contract. Everything you turn in at first, let's go back to the same scenario. And let's just say, hey, when they turned it in, they only gave $2,000, right? They only gave $2,000, but they thought they were giving nothing but the earnest money. Hell, this is saying, hey, look, all monies received of that $2,000, $250 of it is going to be applied to the option fee, excuse me, and then the remaining will go to the earnest money. So in this regard, if they applied $250 of this $2,000 to the option fee, that means that the earnest money is short. And if the earnest money is short, that puts the seller and the buyer in the situation that the seller could terminate the contract based on the earnest money being short. So when we talk to our buyers and we do this, we want to make sure that they put all the monies there. In this case, it would be $2,250 written out to the title company. We don't want to be short on the earnest money and give the seller the option to terminate on the buyer, right? Everybody understand that? Let's go into D. It says buyer authorized escrow agent to release and deliver additional option fee to the seller at any time without further notice or consent from the buyer, and releases escrow agent from any liability of delivery of the additional option fee to the seller. The additional option fee will be credited to the sales price at closing. So simply put, this escrow and title can release this money to the seller without any permission from the buyer, right? They don't need any permission. And then it's also saying, hey, look, if you guys do close, Mr. Buyer, this option monies is applied to the closing, applied to the purchase price. All right, let's go into E. Talks about failure to deliver earnest money. The buyer fails to deliver this earnest money. The seller may terminate this contract and exercise remedies under paragraph 15 by providing a notice to the buyer before the buyer delivers the earnest money. Now, we've had situations where earnest money wasn't delivered on time. Seller did not terminate, but then the earnest money was delivered later. And once the earnest money is delivered, it's satisfied for its performance and the seller is still in contract. They can't, just because the buyer did deliver it on time, the seller didn't terminate, and now the buyer delivers it, and now the seller says, okay, I have the right to terminate. That's not the way it works. The right to terminate is during that period when that earnest money hasn't been delivered on time and any thereafter. But the moment that earnest money is delivered, the contract is still performing. So we've had situations like that. So there's a little small period. Let's say, okay, hey, it was supposed to be delivered in 3 days and it wasn't delivered. Day 4, day 5, day 6, it wasn't delivered. And then on day 7, it was. Your seller had day 4, 5, and 6 to terminate. 7, they're back into it. So just keep that in mind. We've had situations like that. It does come up. Okay. Same thing with that with the option money. It says if the buyer fails to deliver any required option fee within the time required, the buyer shall not have an unrestricted right to terminate. That still applies on the backup addendum. Section G, the backup contract is contingent upon the termination of the previous contract, first contract, dated blank. Now here's where questions come into play. How are you going to know if you're the buyer's agent on the second contract, the backup contract? How are you going to know what the execution date for the sale of property on the first contract, right? You're working with your buyer, and that's another contract of this over there on that house, and you have no idea. This is a different buyer's agent, right? So how are you going to find out this information? There's 2 ways you could find out. They want you to go and say, oh, go look into the MLS and look at the execution date or what date they went in effect in the MLS. Yeah, that's one way. It's not always the best way because agents don't go in there and automatically do it right there on the spot. The minute, second that they execute, they go in and put it in the effective date. So what you would have to do, you probably have to pick up the phone and call that listing agent and ask them, hey, what's the effective date of your first contract? That's probably how you're going to really find out. Picking up the phone or texting or whatever and find that date out. You could get lucky and the listing agent actually annotated in the MLS and has that there, hopefully. But if not, pick up the phone. So it also says, except as provided by the addendum, neither party is required to perform under the backup contract while it is contingent upon the termination of the first contract. So that's pretty self-explanatory there. Now, part H says if the first contract does not terminate on or before blank date, the backup contract terminates and the earnest money would be refunded. Seller must notify buyer immediately of the termination of the first contract. For purposes of performance, the effective date of the backup contract changes to the date the buyer receives notice of termination of the first contract, which is called the amended effective date. Now, how do you come up with that date? The best way, I think, to come up with that date is a simple question to your buyer. How long do you want to play around with this contract to find out if they are going to go forward, not go forward, whatever case may be? That's the simplest way to do it. Some people say, okay, hey, they find out when the option period is over on the first. I've heard people sit there and say, oh, we're willing to hang on until the appraisal. There's no really set time. It really boils down to how long your buyer is willing to wait on first contract to terminate. And that's the date that you put in section H. As simply as that for me. Okay. That's my experience. All right. Okay. All right. I. It says an amendment or modification of first contract would not terminate the first contract, meaning that, hey, they go back and forth in extensions, they go back and forth and all this other stuff with amendments and changes and stuff like that. That doesn't terminate the first contract. They're still in contract and backup position is still in back position. You're still in second position. That doesn't matter to anything for this to be effective. It says J, says if buyer has the unrestricted right to terminate the backup, the time given notice of termination begins on the effective date of the backup contract. It continues after the amended effective date and ends upon expiration of the buyer's unrestricted termination to right to terminate on the backup contract. So here, let's go through with the same scenario. There's a first position contract, and now your buyer goes in second position with an executed backup contract. And this contract has to be executed the same way with everything else that we do. It has to be executed. They're sitting on the sideline. They're waiting, and they just wake up one morning and they want to terminate. Yes, they can terminate as long as they've got the unrestricted right to terminate. Let's say they get notified, and now they're in this amended effective date. We go back to what was up here in the timeline. It says, okay, they have 7 days, whatever that looks like. And I should say, not the timeline. I should sit there and say, we go back to the contract, what they put in here, I'm sorry, of what they put over here for the termination option. And that's, they'll still have those additional days to terminate. So if they had 10 days here, then once the amended effective date comes out, they will have 10 additional days from this date. Okay. So those things still apply. So in theory, if you sat there and said, okay, we're going to wait, the first contract over here had a 10-day option from today. Let's put it in perspective. So we got April 25th, 2025 was the effective date. And you said, okay, hey, my buyer is willing to wait 10 days. You find that's a 10-day option, right? So 10 days from today, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, they're willing to hang around to Cinco de Mayo. All right. They get notified that first position fell out of place on the 4th, May 4th. And now that becomes the amended effective date. Because they have put 10 days over here, they will get an additional 10 days from May 4th now, from the amended effective date, that goes in position. And now the option period would be from the 4th of May, 10 days of the unrestricted, as long as they had the unrestricted right to terminate. So that's how that works. Let's go back over here. And last but not least, for this to be effective, you have both parties to sign. And it has to be added to paragraph 22, like I told you before. In order to complete this whole process, you have to have paragraph 22 annotated for addendum for backup contract. Everything's still the same. All things still the same. It still has to go through being executed. Everybody has to sign. All that is still the same. Okay. Questions, comments? All righty. Short and sweet today. Y'all have a good one. Okay. All right. Talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Bye. Is that Carmelo?